Maria Rodriguez's tiny apartment trembled as another alien warship passed overhead, its shadow crawling across her worn boxing posters like an eclipse. She sat on her threadbare couch, still in her training gear, watching the emergency broadcast for the 10th time that morning. The coffee in her hands had gone cold hours ago. Citizens are advised to remain calm. The announcer's voice wavered slightly. The Galactic Warrior Federation continues to maintain their position above all major Earth cities. No hostile actions have been reported in the last 12 hours. Maria's phone buzzed again. Another cancellation for tomorrow's training sessions. Most of her students were huddled in basements or shelters, expecting the worst. She couldn't blame them. The aliens' arrival 3 days ago had shattered humanity's illusion of solitude in the universe, and their message had been clear. They were looking for worthy opponents. The broadcast switched to footage from inside the lead warship. The alien warriors stood in their command center, a collection of species that seemed designed for combat. Some had multiple arms bearing natural armor. Others rippled with muscles that would put Earth's strongest to shame. Their leader, a towering figure with iridescent scales and eyes that gleamed with predatory intelligence, was speaking. "Your military response is..." The translator paused, searching for the right word. "Quaint. Primitive. We have conquered 300 star systems, faced warriors bred for combat over millennia. Your weapons are inefficient. Your tactics are predictable. We expected more from a species that survived this long in isolation." Maria found herself studying their movements, an old habit from watching opponent footage. Despite their imposing forms, they all shared a similar rigidity in their stances. No flow, no adaptation, just raw power waiting to be unleashed. The broadcast cut to scenes from their previous conquests. Battles that ended in moments as their champions overwhelmed other species with brute force or technological superiority. Maria noticed something in their eyes. Not pride, but boredom. These weren't conquerors seeking territory. They were warriors seeking a challenge. A new transmission interrupted the footage. The alien leader's face filled the screen, but something had changed in their expression. "We have been monitoring your information networks," they announced. "We have discovered something puzzling. You have recordings of humans engaging in recreational combat, explaining purpose, entertainment, training, religious ritual." The screen split to show clips from various combat sports. MMA fights, boxing matches, wrestling competitions. Maria recognized several of her colleagues in the footage. The alien leader's confusion was evident. You willingly engage in physical combat, without weaponry, without enhancement. You deliberately restrict your methods of attack. The translator couldn't quite capture the mix of bewilderment and intrigue in their tone. And these combatants, they survive. They continue to fight again. Maria set down her coffee cup, leaning forward. The tension in the alien's voice had shifted from dismissal to genuine curiosity. "We are revising our approach," the leader announced. "Your species clearly possesses an understanding of combat we have not encountered before. We propose a challenge. Present your greatest warrior to face our champions. Should they prove worthy, Earth will be granted full membership in the Galactic Warrior Federation. Should they fail..." The translator didn't need to finish the sentence. The broadcast cut back to the news anchor, who began discussing the implications of this unexpected development. But Maria wasn't listening anymore. She was already wrapping her hands, moving to the punching bag hanging in the corner of her apartment. Her morning workout had been interrupted by the latest broadcast, and she never skipped training. As she settled into her rhythm, throwing combinations that had been drilled into muscle memory over thousands of hours, she smiled slightly. The aliens were looking for a challenge. Maybe it was time they learned why humans had turned combat into an art form, why they practiced fighting not just to win, but to master themselves. The shadows of the warships continued to drift across her window as she trained, their presence no longer seeming quite so threatening. The United Earth Defense Council chamber buzzed with tension as holographic displays showcased their candidates. General Santos paced before the projections, gesturing at each potential champion in turn. The Kestrel program's finest, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, enhanced reaction times, reinforced skeletal structure, combat AI neural link. The hologram showed a woman moving through combat drills with inhuman precision. Or perhaps Marcus Webb, our top-ranked MMA fighter, recently upgraded with the latest combat prosthetics. In the back row of the observation gallery, Maria wiped sweat from her forehead with a hand wrap. She'd come straight from training, her gym bag still slung over her shoulder. The security guards had almost denied her entry until they recognized her face from professional fights. "With all due respect, General," Dr. Patel interrupted from her seat at the council table, "the alien specifically expressed interest in our unaugmented combat traditions. Sending an enhanced fighter might be seen as missing the point." The general's face reddened. "Doctor, this isn't about making a cultural statement. The fate of Earth hangs in the balance. We need every advantage. May I speak?" Maria's voice carried clearly through the chamber, despite its softness. Heads turned, some council members noticing her for the first time. "This is a closed session," the general began, but Council Chair Martinez raised a hand. "Let her speak. That's Maria Rodriguez. Her record speaks for itself." Maria stood, moving to the center of the chamber with the fluid grace that had become her trademark. "You're all approaching this wrong," she said, watching the holographic displays of enhanced warriors. "The aliens aren't looking for another show of force. They've seen plenty of that." She unwrapped her hands as she spoke, the simple cotton strips a stark contrast to the high-tech displays around her. "They're intrigued because we fight for reasons they don't understand, because we challenge ourselves without necessity." "Pretty philosophy," General Santos scoffed, "but it won't help when you're facing a 9-foot alien with natural armor." Maria smiled slightly. "Would you like to test that theory, General? You have 3 enhanced candidates here. Let me demonstrate what I mean." The chamber erupted in murmurs. Chair Martinez leaned forward, interested. "You're proposing to fight them? All 3? 5 minutes. No enhancements. No weapons. Just skill against technology." The general's laugh died as he saw Martinez nodding. The candidates were summoned. Chen with her neural links, Webb with his prosthetics, and a third, a towering soldier named Kumar with experimental muscle density treatment. Maria removed her shoes, stepping onto the chamber's central platform. The candidates surrounded her, their enhanced forms making her seem small in comparison. Someone started a timer. What followed wasn't so much a fight as a demonstration. Maria moved like water through their attacks, never staying still long enough to be caught. Chen's AI-predicted strikes hit empty air. Webb's enhanced speed meant nothing when he couldn't corner his target. Kumar's strength was useless against an opponent who used his own momentum against him. 4 minutes and 30 seconds later, all 3 enhanced fighters were on the ground. Maria hadn't thrown a single punch above their shoulders, just precise, devastating body shots and footwork that seemed to defy physics. She helped Chen up, speaking to the stunned council. "The aliens want to understand why we fight. Send them someone who embodies that understanding, not someone trying to match their advantages." The chamber remained silent as she rewrapped her hands. Chair Martinez was the first to speak. All in favor of selecting Maria Rodriguez as Earth's champion. The vote was unanimous. Even General Santos raised his hand, though his expression remained skeptical. As Maria left the chamber, she heard Dr. Patel ask, "Are you sure you don't want any enhancements? We could at least offer some basic protection." "No," Maria replied, shouldering her gym bag. "They need to see us as we are. Besides," she smiled, "I haven't spent 20 years perfecting my technique to abandon it now." The council watched her go, wondering if they'd just made the best decision of their lives, or the last one they'd ever make. The alien training facility dwarfed any gym Maria had ever seen, its ceiling lost in the darkness above. Technical marvels surrounded her small corner: anti-gravity chambers, neural combat simulators, and devices she couldn't begin to understand. Yet she had insisted on a simple setup: canvas floor, heavy bag, speed bag, and a ring with actual ropes. A crowd of alien observers had gathered again, as they did every day. Today's group included a cluster of Krell warriors, their armored forms towering over the others. They watched with what Maria had learned to recognize as confusion as she began her routine. Inefficient movement patterns detected, one of the alien analysts announced, their translator making the words sound clinical. Subject expends 47% more energy than necessary for basic locomotion. Maria continued her footwork drills, dancing around imaginary opponents. Her shoes whispered against the canvas in rhythms learned over countless hours. Shadow boxing came next, combinations flowing into each other with practiced precision. Why does she not activate her combat protocols? A young Krell asked its elder. She performs the same movements daily without engaging targets. The elder Krell's response carried notes of frustration. Humans lack combat protocols. They practice, a primitive method of programming muscle responses. Maria's coach, old Tommy Garcia, had insisted on coming with her to the alien facility. He watched the aliens with amusement as he held the pads for Maria's combination work. "Show them the 3-2 pivot," he called out in Spanish. The alien's sensors lit up as Maria demonstrated the move, a left hook flowing into a right cross while pivoting off her back foot. The movement looked simple but contained decades of boxing theory. Structural weakness identified, another analyst declared. During rotation, 1.3 seconds of compromised defense. Recommendation: install stabilizing augments. That's not weakness, Tommy barked, forgetting the aliens weren't familiar with human expressions of frustration. That's creating opportunity. Watch again. Maria repeated the combination, this time showing how the momentary shift in balance allowed for greater power generation, while setting up angles for the next series of punches. The aliens' combat computers struggled to classify the movements, trying to force them into known combat algorithms. A particularly bold young Krell warrior stepped forward. "I request demonstration," it announced. Theory: an augmented human cannot generate sufficient force to penetrate Krell combat plating. Tommy started to object, but Maria nodded. 3 punches, she said. That's all I need. The Krell assumed what it considered a defensive stance, rigid, immobile, relying on its natural armor. Maria studied its position for a moment, then threw her combination. Left jab to the visual sensor cluster, not to damage, but to trigger an instinctive protective response. Right hook to the midsection, causing the Krell to shift its weight slightly. Left hook to the exact point where the previous punch had landed. The Krell staggered, its armor showing a hairline crack. Force multiplication through precision targeting, Maria explained to the stunned observers. Every weakness, no matter how small, can be exploited if you know how to create and recognize opportunities. The alien analysts fell into furious discussion, their combat computers calculating new possibilities. The young Krell warrior touched its damaged armor with something approaching respect. "Perhaps," Tommy said quietly to Maria as she returned to her workout, "they're finally starting to understand why we call it the sweet science." Maria nodded, returning to her shadowboxing. Each punch, each step, each pivot carried the weight of human innovation. Centuries of fighters learning to turn limitation into advantage, weakness into opportunity, practice into artistry. The alien observers remained until she finished her session, their sensors recording every movement. As she cooled down, Maria caught sight of several young aliens in a corner. The alien arena pulsed with energy as Maria wrapped her hands in her preparation chamber. The walls displayed constantly updating odds from across the galaxy, none of them in her favor. Outside, she could hear the crowds roar as the Krell champion, Vorkath, was introduced. "Last chance for enhancements," Dr. Paddle said, holding up a medkit filled with combat stems and neural boosters. "The Krell's exoskeleton can generate enough force to shatter concrete. Maria continued wrapping her hands, the familiar ritual calming her nerves. "That's good to know," she said. "But no thanks." She flexed her fingers, testing the wrap's tension. "Tommy, how do they feel?" Her coach inspected the wraps with practiced eyes. "Perfect. Remember what we discussed. First round is for reading." The chamber door opened, revealing a corridor that seemed to stretch for miles. As Maria walked toward the arena, she heard the alien announcer's translated voice echoing through the structure. Presenting the human candidate, Maria Lightning Rodriguez. Combat mass, 65.8 kilograms. Augmentation status, none detected. Combat methodology, classification pending. She emerged into lights that would have blinded her if Tommy hadn't insisted on practicing under increasingly harsh illumination for the past week. The arena itself was a perfect circle, 5 times the size of any boxing ring she'd fought in. The floor shifted slightly under her feet, absorbing impact like memory foam. Across the arena stood Vorkath. 8 feet of bioengineered perfection, its exoskeleton gleaming under the lights. Maria noticed small repair marks on its midsection, the same spot where she had cracked the younger Krell's armor during training. "Combat protocols engaged," Vorkath announced, its translator making the words sound like grinding metal. "Victory parameters set. Incapacitation or surrender." Maria bounced lightly on her toes, establishing her rhythm. "Works for me." The arena's barrier field activated, creating a transparent dome over the fighting space. A tone sounded, signaling the start of the first round. Vorkath moved with surprising speed for its size, covering half the distance between them in a single bound. Its first strike would have taken Maria's head off if she hadn't already started moving. She slipped past the blow, feeling the air displacement ruffle her hair. The crowd's excitement turned to confusion as Maria continued to move, throwing only occasional jabs that seemed to barely touch the Krell champion. Vorkath launched combination after combination, each more powerful than the last, but hit nothing but air. "Human contestant shows signs of fear response," the announcer declared, avoiding all meaningful engagement. Tommy's voice cut through the noise from her corner. "Beautiful movement, Maria. Show them what reading means." She was doing exactly that, cataloging everything about her opponent. The slight delay when Vorkath reset after a power strike. The tendency to protect its left side more than its right. The growing frustration in its movements as it failed to land clean hits. By the round's final minute, Vorkath's attacks had become more aggressive, more committed. Perfect. Maria picked her moment, waiting for a particularly powerful swing, then stepped inside the Krell's guard. One short right hand to the body, angled up under the armor plates. She was back out of range before Vorkath could counter. The round ended with a confused silence from the crowd. The alien combat analysts were arguing among themselves, trying to understand why she hadn't pressed her momentary advantage. In her corner, Tommy applied ice to her shoulders. "Got what you needed." Maria nodded, taking small sips of water. "That repair work on its midsection. It's not fully cured. The molecular structure's still aligning. I could feel it in that body shot. 3, maybe 4 rounds to work with that weakness." Tommy grinned. "And that's why we read before we write." Across the arena, Vorkath was receiving adjustment suggestions from its technical team, its frustration visible even through its alien features. It didn't understand yet that the real fight was just beginning. A thin line of blood trickled from Maria's split lip as she circled away from Vorkath's latest assault. The Krell champion had adapted faster than expected, using its augmented processing to analyze her movement patterns. 2 solid strikes had gotten through her defense in the last round. "Target's evasion patterns predicted," Vorkath announced, its voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "Combat efficiency now at optimal levels." Maria responded with a quick 1-2 combination, testing the Krell's revised guard. The punches deflected off his armor, seemingly ineffective. In her corner, Tommy nodded approvingly. He'd seen what she'd seen. Human competitor appears to be weakening. The arena announcer declared, "Biometric readings show elevated heart rate and decreased strike force." The alien audience chittered in agreement. They'd never seen a fight last this long. Most of their combat encounters ended in the first exchange of blows. They didn't understand what it meant to pace yourself through 12 rounds. Vorkath pressed forward, its enhanced servo motors whining as it launched a devastating combination. Maria slipped the first 2 strikes, but the third caught her shoulder, sending her spinning. The crowd roared, expecting her to fall. Instead, she used the momentum to launch her own attack, driving 3 precise hooks into the spot where she'd landed that body shot in the first round. Vorkath's armor creaked. "Structural integrity at 97%, the Krell announced, but Maria caught the uncertainty in its translated voice. "Adjusting combat protocols." Tommy's voice cut through the arena noise. "Show them what adaptation really means, Maria." She had been. Every exchange revealed more about Vorkath's fighting style. The Krell relied on its combat computers to analyze and counter opponents, but those computers worked on pattern recognition. They expected consistency. Maria gave them chaos instead. She switched stances mid-combination, threw punches from angles that sacrificed power for precision, and never repeated the same sequence twice. Each movement was designed to disrupt the Krell's predictive algorithms while setting up future opportunities. Combat analysis failing, one of the alien technicians announced. Human fighting patterns show no consistent framework. Blood was now flowing freely from Maria's lip, and her left eye was starting to swell. But Vorkath's movements had become more mechanical, more predictable. Its combat computers were struggling to process a fighting style that evolved minute by minute. "Your pattern recognition is impressive," Maria said between exchanges, her breathing controlled despite the pace. "But patterns can become traps." She demonstrated by launching what appeared to be her standard 1-2 combination. Vorkath's computers predicted the follow-up hook perfectly, raising its guard to block. But the hook never came. Instead, Maria dropped low, driving her right hand into the increasingly compromised section of the Krell's armor. The impact resonated through the arena. "Structural integrity at 82%, Vorkath announced, its voice carrying the first hints of concern. Unable to establish baseline for counter-programming. The alien audience had fallen silent, their combat paradigms being challenged. They were witnessing something their advanced technology couldn't quantify: the human ability to learn, adapt, and overcome within the flow of battle itself. As the round ended, Maria returned to her corner. Tommy worked on her swelling eye while checking her hand wraps. "They still don't understand," he said quietly, applying an ice pack. "They think fighting is about power and prediction." Maria nodded, watching Vorkath receive diagnostic scans from its technical team. The Krell's movements showed increasing signs of stress. Not physical, but computational. Its combat computers were overloading trying to analyze her constantly evolving style. "That's their weakness," she replied. "They're looking for patterns to counter. But humans," she stood as the next round signal approached, "we don't just follow patterns. We create them." The alien analysts' confusion was evident in their commentary. They couldn't grasp how a fighter could be simultaneously damaged and increasingly effective. They were about to learn that sometimes the greatest advantage wasn't strength or speed, but the ability to adapt when those weren't enough. By the 6th round, the fight had taken on a rhythm unlike anything the alien audience had ever witnessed. Vorkath's initial confidence had eroded into visible frustration as its combat computers struggled to maintain tactical cohesion. The damaged section of its armor had spread, microscopic fractures spiraling outward from the point of Maria's focused attacks. "Combat efficiency declining," Vorkath announced, its translator unable to mask the strain in its voice. Unable to establish reliable countermeasures against non-standard combat protocols. Maria moved through the arena with measured grace, her footwork creating angles that Vorkath's predictive systems couldn't anticipate. Each step was deliberate, each position carefully chosen to set up the next sequence of strikes. The human strategy becomes apparent. The arena announcer declared. Continuous targeting of compromised armor sections indicates. The announcement cut off as Maria suddenly shifted her attack pattern, targeting a completely different section of Vorkath's armor. The Krell champion's defense, prepared for another strike to its midsection, left it exposed to a series of hooks that rattled its shoulder plating. Multiple structural weaknesses detected. Vorkath's diagnostic systems blared. Recommend immediate defensive protocols. But those protocols, designed for short, decisive encounters, weren't adapted for prolonged strategic combat. The Krell champion's movements became increasingly rigid as it tried to protect multiple vulnerable points simultaneously. Tommy's voice carried across the arena. Show them what pressure really means. Maria responded by increasing her output, not with wild flurries but with precise, measured combinations. Each punch built upon the damage done by previous strikes, creating a cascade of stress points across Vorkath's armor. Combat analysis systems approaching maximum capacity, one of the alien technicians reported. Unable to process combat variations at current speed. The alien audience watched in growing amazement as their champion, armed with technologies refined across centuries of warfare, was systematically broken down by what they had dismissed as primitive technique. Vorkath launched a desperate assault, its servos whining as it committed fully to a devastating combination. Maria saw it coming, not through enhanced prediction software, but through thousands of hours of reading human opponents' desperation moves. She slipped the first strike, blocked the second, and when the third came, she wasn't there anymore. The Krell's momentum carried it forward, its balance compromised for just a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. Maria's counter combination landed with surgical precision. Left hook to the shoulder joint, straight right to the compromised midsection, and a left uppercut that caught the exact point where multiple stress fractures intersected. The sound of cracking armor echoed through the arena. Critical system failure imminent, Vorkath's diagnostic system announced. Combat effectiveness reduced to 47% and declining. But numbers couldn't capture what the audience was witnessing. The Krell champion's movements had lost their fluid precision, its advanced combat systems overwhelmed by the need to process too many variables simultaneously. They thought fighting was just about hitting harder, Tommy muttered in Maria's corner during a brief clinch. Show them what happens when you hit smarter. Maria nodded, tasting blood from her split lip. Her left eye was nearly swollen shut, and her knuckles burned despite the wrapping. But she saw something in Vorkath's movements that the alien combat computers couldn't quantify. Uncertainty. For the first time in its fighting career, the Krell champion faced an opponent it couldn't outpower, outcalculate, or overwhelm. Its combat protocols, designed to exploit patterns, were useless against a fighter who treated each moment as unique. As the round drew to a close, the alien analysts had fallen silent. Their combat paradigms, built on the assumption that superior technology would always prevail, were being systematically dismantled by a fighter who relied on nothing but trained skill and calculated strategy. In her corner, Maria let Tommy work on her swollen eye, while she watched Vorkath's technical team scrambling to reinforce its failing armor. They still didn't understand. The physical damage was just a symptom. The real breaking point wasn't in the armor. It was in the mind. The seventh round opened with Vorkath's systems blaring warnings in multiple alien languages. Its once pristine armor now bore a web of stress fractures, each one meticulously created through Maria's relentless targeting. The Krell champion's movements had lost their fluid certainty, becoming increasingly mechanical as its combat computers struggled to process the flood of tactical variables. Energy efficiency critical, Vorkath's diagnostic system announced. Power reserves at 31%. Unable to maintain optimal combat protocols. Maria circled patiently, her own breathing controlled despite the punishment she'd absorbed. Blood from her split lip had dried on her chin, and her left eye was swollen nearly shut, but her footwork remained precise, her head movement economic and purposeful. The human demonstrates unexpected endurance, the arena announcer observed. maintaining combat efficiency despite sustained damage. Tommy's voice cut through the background noise. This is where we live, Maria. Deep waters. She understood perfectly. While Vorkath's systems had been designed for explosive power and short-term tactical superiority, human boxers trained specifically for extended battles. Every training session, every sparring round, every conditioning drill had prepared her for this moment. The Krell champion launched another assault, its servos whining with effort. The combination looked impressive, a blur of strikes that would have overwhelmed most opponents. But Maria saw the desperation in the attack, the way Vorkath committed too fully to each punch. She weathered the storm, blocking what she could and rolling with what she couldn't, waiting for her moment. It came as Vorkath's power reserves dropped further, causing a millisecond delay in its recovery time. Maria's counter combination was textbook perfect. Jab to disrupt vision, right cross to the compromised midsection, left hook targeting the intersection of stress fractures along the shoulder plate. Each punch flowed into the next with an efficiency that no combat computer could fully analyze. Structural integrity failing. Vorkath's systems blared. Multiple critical breaches detected. Combat effectiveness reduced to 28%. The alien audience watched in stunned silence as their champion's advanced technology proved insufficient against human endurance and adaptability. They had never considered that victory could come not through overwhelming force, but through the patient accumulation of small advantages. Your systems are failing, Maria said during a clinch, her voice carrying clearly through Vorkath's translators. But I can do this all day. It wasn't a boast. It was a fundamental truth about human combat sports. Champions weren't made in single explosive moments, but in thousands of rounds of training, countless hours of conditioning, and the mental fortitude to continue when every system screamed for rest. Vorkath's next attack showed clear signs of degradation. Its targeting was off, its power diminished, its recovery time significantly delayed. The combat computers, designed to process clear patterns and counter them, were overwhelmed by the organic complexity of human boxing. Maria saw her opening and took it. A perfect combination. Each punch building on the damage done by previous rounds, each strike precisely targeted to exploit the weaknesses she'd created. The final blow, a right cross that seemed to carry the weight of centuries of boxing knowledge, connected with surgical precision. The sound of failing armor echoed through the arena as Vorkath's systems finally reached their breaking point. The Krell champion staggered, its combat protocols shattering along with its defensive plating. Combat capabilities critically compromised. The diagnostic system announced, unable to maintain fighting effectiveness, initiating emergency shutdown. The alien referees rushed forward as Vorkath's systems began to power down, its mighty frame sagging as emergency protocols took over. The fight was over. In her corner, Tommy wrapped her in a fierce embrace, his voice thick with emotion. You showed them, kid. You showed them what it really means to be a fighter. Maria nodded, watching as the alien technicians swarmed around their fallen champion. She had done more than win a fight. She had demonstrated that humanity's greatest strength wasn't in their technology or physical power, but in their capacity to endure, adapt, and overcome. The arena erupted in a sound that transcended species and translation. The universal recognition of true warrior spirit. 3 months after the historic fight, Maria stood in her renovated Mexico City gym, watching as a young Krell warrior attempted to mirror her footwork. The once empty training floor now hosted beings from across the galaxy, all drawn by humanity's unique approach to combat. Your movement patterns are too rigid, she explained, demonstrating the subtle weight shifts that made defensive maneuvers effective. Don't try to calculate the perfect angle. Feel the flow of motion. The Krell student, like many of its kind, struggled with the concept of intuitive movement. Its combat computers kept trying to reduce fluid motion into mathematical formulas. I do not understand, it admitted, its translator conveying genuine frustration. How can combat be effective without precise calculations? Maria smiled, remembering her own early struggles with boxing's fundamentals. "Here," she said, wrapping the Krell's massive hands with traditional cotton hand wraps. "Sometimes you have to learn by doing, not by thinking." Across the gym, Tawny worked with a group of alien warriors from various species, teaching them the basics of the sweet science. The scene would have been unimaginable just months ago. Beings engineered for combat learning to box like humans. "Rodriguez champion," a familiar voice called. Maria turned to see Vorkath entering the gym, its armor now bearing the scars of their historic battle like badges of honor. "The Federation Council requests your presence. More species seek to understand human combat methodologies." Since the fight, the Galactic Warrior Federation had undergone a fundamental shift in its combat philosophy. The revelation that superior technology could be overcome by skill and strategy had sparked a renaissance in martial arts across the galaxy. "They're still trying to quantify it, aren't they?" Maria asked, helping a particularly frustrated alien student perfect their jab technique. Vorkath's translator produced something close to a chuckle. "Indeed. The combat analysts have written 67,000 pages attempting to create a unified theory of human boxing. They cannot accept that some knowledge must be earned through experience rather than computation." Maria had become something of a legend in the Federation, not for her victory alone, but for what it represented: the triumph of trained skill over innate advantage, of adaptation over raw power. Her gym had become a pilgrimage site for warriors seeking to understand how a physically inferior species had developed such effective combat techniques. "Show them again," Tommy called out, gathering the students. "Show them what we really teach here." Maria nodded, stepping into the ring with one of her advanced students, a being whose natural armor and enhanced strength dwarfed her own capabilities. What followed wasn't just a demonstration of technique, but a philosophy of combat that had evolved over centuries of human development. Every move told a story. Of fighters who had turned disadvantage into opportunity, of trainers who had refined movement into art, of generations who had proved that the greatest victories often came not from overwhelming force, but from the willingness to endure, adapt, and overcome. The alien students watched in fascination as Maria nullified her opponent's superior attributes through technique and timing. They were beginning to understand that true combat mastery wasn't about maximizing advantages, but about transcending limitations. "This is why we train," she explained after the demonstration, addressing the gathered students. "Not to become invincible, but to become adaptable. Not to overpower, but to understand. Every limitation is an opportunity to innovate." As the day's training session ended, Maria watched her diverse group of students practice their combinations on heavy bags, each one struggling to unlearn centuries of combat programming and embrace a more organic approach to fighting. Vorkath approached her again, its posture showing the respect earned through combat. "The Federation was wrong," it said. "We sought worthy opponents, thinking strength alone made a warrior. You taught us that true worth lies not in power, but in how we overcome our limitations." Maria smiled, unwrapping her hands after another long day of teaching. The galaxy had sought Earth's greatest warrior, expecting to find superior technology or enhanced capabilities. Instead, they had found something far more valuable: the human spirit's endless capacity to transform weakness into strength, limitation into opportunity, and combat into art.